The East India Company had been facing small and large mutinies for decades before this rebellion. It wasn't the first. This was the coming together of centuries of grievances felt by small and, small farmers and large landholders, princes and peasants, in the army and in the civilian population. And the fact that they could actually come together in this dramatic way is what the British simply didn't appreciate and understand. And they were caught off guard. The rebellion was defeated by Indians. Indians fighting against other Indians. There were pressure points, there were turning points, and things could have gone different.
The British are actually involved in a number of other places at the same time. China, with the Opium Wars going on, they've just had a problem in Persia. They've actually got a problem in South Africa at the same time. And so they're quite overstretched.
So if the British are kicked out...
The British are kicked out. You basically delay the India we see today.
Absolutely,
by 2 generations, probably. It's as simple as that.
It's May 1857, and in northern India, a rebellion is erupting that could threaten a century of British colonial expansion. The East India Company has had a trading foothold here since the 1600s, but truly began to seize control after taking Bengal in 1757. Yet now there was mutiny, and what started among Indian soldiers grew to include peasants and civilians, as the last Mughal emperor was declared ruler of India. Yet British rule would not be overthrown. After 18 months of brutal fighting, the rebellion was crushed, and the East India Company dissolved, meaning the country would now be ruled directly by the British Crown. It was a defining moment in the birth of modern India and Britain's imperial history. But what if the rebellion had succeeded? I'm Fergus Macphee, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every episode, we focus on a different military campaign or a tide of history, and with the help of our experts, we ask whether those split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today is the Indian Rebellion of 1857, a major uprising against the rule of the British East India Company that had monumental consequences for the country and the subcontinent. So what if the capture of Delhi had held? What if the rebellion had spread wider and the British found themselves overwhelmed? These are, of course, questions for our experts. And joining me today, as ever, the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry. And for the first time on the channel, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Chandrika Kaul, modern British imperial historian at the University of St Andrews. Welcome to you both. Now, before we talk about the events of the rebellion itself, we're going to have to go back a little bit and ask ourselves how we got there in the first place. Now, in front of me, we have a fantastic map. It's a split screen of India showing the territory covered by the British East India Company. On the left, we have 1765, and on the right, we have 1857 on the eve of rebellion. Chandrika, welcome to History Undone. It's a pleasure to have you in the studio. I want to ask you first about the East India Company and how we got here, because their story, to people who might not know, a lot of our international and American viewers and listeners, is almost kind of hard to believe.
Yes, I think the East India Company has been compared to the first really global multinational. But this was a trading company with a difference, because this was a company with a standing army. It had recruited mercenaries from all over the world, including Indians. In fact, Indians dominated the army. And by the time the rebellion broke out in 1857, this army was actually larger. It's almost 300,000 people. And it was even larger than the British army. So imagine a trading company with a huge army. And so they basically spent about 200 years leading up to the rebellion in defeating other European rivals like the Danes, the Dutch, and finally the French. The rivalry between the French trading company and the East India Company, of course, matched the rivalry in North America. And it was said that the French defeat there was echoed in their being finally defeated by the English East India Company. But I think it's really important to recognize that they weren't in it on their own. They had formed strategic alliances with numerous large and small Indian principalities across the length and breadth of the subcontinent. And this is what helped them finally defeat the French.
And Chris, welcome back to History Undone. as Chandrika sort of sets out there, are they so big as a company? Are they sort of almost intertwined with the British state at this point?
Well, it's quite a distant sort of relationship, really. The Colonial Office is involved. The Cabinet's obviously involved in it, but it's one of those companies that's too big to fail, too big to take on, that's for sure, because it generates its own income. It's a trading company. It's got very good share price by modern standards and things like that. And of course, it has a complete ecosystem that surrounds it. So, for example, the public school Haileybury was the training college for people who are going to work for the East India Company. And the East India Club today, you can see that up in London. So you've got this vast, as Chandrika says, this vast multinational, and it is a multinational corporate institution that is essentially saying to the British government, we'll run it for you. Don't need to worry about it. We'll pay our taxes. And we need a little bit of help from the Navy every now and then, but we've got our own army. And I'm afraid to say that the regulation of the East India Company is very lax. So you get these nabobs, as they're called, who are directors of the company, who very much do what they want in terms of diplomacy in India and in relation to how they actually run things within the company, who they trade with, and so forth. And occasionally they get basically the British government into trouble because they overreach themselves every now and then, and they need sort of sorting out. And so it really grows out of the 7 Years' War, to tell you the truth, as Chandrika says, you know, in taking on the French, in defeating every local rival at Plassey in 1757. That then grows towards 1763, end of the 7 Years' War. What has happened, basically, is that India is a British playground. Yeah. And the expansion that takes place after that is a function of the East India Company being in a monopoly. That's the point. A monopoly company. It's trading with anybody it wants to. Yeah.
But I think the important thing to always emphasise is that it's much more than just a trading company.
Yes.
It is, in fact, ruling India. Yeah. It has de jure political rights. It has rights to collect land revenue, to tax the people, to enforce law and order, to make rules, to govern principalities, large and small, across the length and breadth of the subcontinent. So it's actually a governing power in all but name.
And that is where the roots of the mutiny begin, right? I mean, if you look at these two maps, as Chris said, it began with Plassey in 1757. The territory changes in pink are stark. Is it fair to say that for the reasons for rebellion, it's not necessarily just one thing, it's 100 years of resentment?
Well, absolutely. I mean, there was a saying that 1857 was 100 years from 1757 and something was going to happen. But if you look at this map, you notice that the areas covered pink under company control is dwarfed by those parts of the subcontinent which are not covered pink. So the important thing to remember is that notionally you have ruling powers in all these other areas that are rivals of the company. They have treaties with the company. But one of the reasons why a lot of these principalities rise up, particularly in the Indo-Gangetic plain and in central India, the south is more or less calm and loyal. And the Punjab, which is one of the last parts of the subcontinent to be taken over before the rebellion, surprisingly doesn't join in the rebellion. Most of Punjab, particularly to the east, actually support and are critical to defeating the rebels.
I think it's worth mentioning that the East India Company is moving into the remains of the old Mughal Empire. And the last ruler, who is nominally the King of Delhi, has been set up by the company just to focus loyalty and also to be a sort of single point that they can deal with. Now, he with his family are set up in Delhi, and the remnants of that Mughal Empire are in people's minds. Yeah. Now, it's quite interesting that Punjab and up here remember what it's like under the Mughal Empire. And actually, as you see at the start of the mutiny, the rebellion, that actually they go, I think we prefer the British to how it used to be, which explains why they were quite loyal at the beginning.
Yeah, and the East India Company used those tensions as the Mughal Empire collapses in the 1700s. They sort of used those tensions to gain this territory.
Well, it was classic divide and rule. Yeah. They used allies amongst Indian principalities to fight other Indian principalities. So they had supporters and opponents. And one of the principal reasons why a lot of these disgruntled princes, if you like, came together was their desire to get rid of this foreign overweening power. So, for example, the Marathas, the Rani of Jhansi, the Nawab of Awadh. Now, we're talking about the Indo-Gangetic Plain and Central India, okay?
Mm-hmm.
They are
a huge area.
Huge
I should make clear.
Absolutely huge areas. But they were in the vanguards of the rebellion. However, others, their rivals in the south, for instance, in Hyderabad, the Nizam didn't want the Marathas to become more powerful, so he didn't join in, even though there were the beginnings of mutiny in Hyderabad. So you see, this internal disaffection played into the schemes of the company. However, there was much more widespread disaffection by this time. Remember, the East India Company had been misruling for centuries, and they had managed to upset just about everybody. You know, the peasantry, the business classes, the small landholders, the big landholders, the princely states, and particularly in the 1850s, and I think Chris wanted to talk about this, Lord Dalhousie really put a spanner in the final spanner in the work, if you like.
Well, let's get on to the reasons for rebellion, because I think you're talking about the doctrine of lapsy.
Yeah.
Well, partly. I mean, Lord Dalhousie, he's 35, and when he comes out to India, he's classically trained, which is interesting. In fact, quite a lot of the administrators are classically trained. That's actually quite important here because the East India Company is run very much like the Roman Empire. And some of the things that we see in this come straight out of the classical period. So Lord Dalhousie, he starts saying, look, we're going to modernise, we're going to Christianise part of this as well. So there's a religious element to it.
It's a religious war as much as a...
Well, for some of them, for the Muslims and also for the Hindus, there are elements of religious about it, and we'll come on to that. But there is a very pushy missionary effort as well. But at the end of the day, Dalhousie says, we're going to modernise, we're going to stop widows obviously having to kill themselves when their husbands die. We're going to say that widows can inherit property. You see English legal practice coming in. So there's a lot of modernising going on. But he makes two very, very interesting moves. One is the General Service Enlistment Act in 1856, which basically says we can actually use our troops, our sepoys, abroad. Now, it's only for new recruits. That's the key point. But the word gets around, it's for everybody. Now, in 1824, there had been a very serious mutiny at a place called Barrackpore, which is in the east, when the East India Company wanted to send troops to Burma. Now, that had been put down after a very serious mutiny, which should have been a warning. Remember, this is in the parents' generation of the people who actually revolt. And the mutineers were all sentenced to 10 years in jail. Some of them were executed. So there was a bit of a foreshadow going on there. So that was the first thing. The second thing is the doctrine of lapse. Now, this is straight out of the Roman Republic, in fact, where if, for example, a principality or one of these petty kingdoms or princedoms here actually failed to have an heir, the East India Company took it over. And this is just how the Romans used to do it. Now, what happens is in Oud, they decide that the very sybaritic, fairly sort of promiscuous
Wajid Ali Shah.
Prince there is in his 30s, but he spends most of his time in the bedroom. And they say, right, we're going to take over Oud. And most of the recruiting for the Bengal army comes from Oud. And the company takes it over in 1856 and says, excuse me, move aside. Now,
am I right? A lot of the sepoys are from that area as well.
It's a big recruiting area. It's a very high caste area for recruiting as well. But he's also done it to 6 other principalities as well. And all this area around here is thick so Bihar is one of them. So we see the rebellion being very thick there as well. Janshi to the south as well.
One of the elements of the doctrine of lapse was that they had several excuses. One was misgovernment, and Awadh was taken over under the guise of misgovernment because, as you rightly said, Nawab Wajid Ali Shah was a poet. He didn't particularly want to govern. He didn't want the responsibilities. But in Jhansi, it was because the Queen, Rani Lakshmi Bai, didn't have a male heir. She had adopted a young male relative to succeed as her heir. And under the doctrine of lapse, that wasn't allowed.
Under Dalhousie's...
Under Dalhousie's doctrine of lapse, that wasn't allowed. Now, that happened with some other principalities too, like the Marathas. So those were stratagems that backfired dramatically, because some of these, like Awadh, like Jhansi, like Kanpur with the Marathas, they were not going to take this lying down. But final point, and I think Chris has rightly mentioned this, about high caste recruits.
Yeah.
I think the important thing to recognise here is that the East India Company had three armies. The Bengal army is the only one that was really affected by the rebellion. And the Bengal army, which was about 150,000 strong, was the largest of the three armies, the other two being Bombay and Madras. But
which is modern-day Chennai?
Which is modern-day Chennai, yes. And the Bengal army had a massive recruitment policy of high caste recruits. Yeah. So some of these slights and slurs going back decades that were inflicted on the population, including racial slurs, were felt deeply by these high caste recruits in the Bengal army. And that actually fueled the kind of rebellion we do see, the kind of intensity of the rebellion, and also led a lot of company historians to talk about a Hindu reaction.
Of course.
Because of the caste system. So this idea of not serving abroad was because they would lose their caste if they went over the black waters or Kala Pani. It's complicated and complex. And what the East India Company officers, as Chris has rightly said, they simply disregarded some of these sensitivities, and the pressures built up over decades. It wasn't an overnight.
Well, that disregarding and those sensitivities, I'm sounding like a broken record to those watching at home here on History Undone. We talk a lot about tinderbox moments and trigger points, and there is a very famous one for the Indian Rebellion. It all centres around the Enfield Rifles. Chris?
So you go February 1857, you essentially have a problem to do with cartridges. And it's to do with the Enfield rifle, which is a modern rifle compared with some of the weapons that the army has here. And the essential issue is that you actually have to bite the end off the cartridge before it goes into the breech. And initially, it is lubricated very, very generously, actually, with what everybody thought contained animal fat. And the word went round, it was either pig fat or it was cow fat. And it probably was, actually, to tell the truth. That problem was recognised as being an issue. So people said, look, mix your own lubricant, vegetable oil, and beeswax. But that doesn't go away. Now, I think, and it's something I've done some research on recently, that there's a drug problem in the Bengal army because the opium wars are happening in China right now. And if you look at Mungal Pandey, who is the first person to actually mutiny, and he gets hung for it, of course, he actually says in his testimony, in his trial, he says, I think I was affected by having bang and opium, which I've been taking recently. I'd never done it before, but I've been doing it locally. And looking throughout the Bengal army, you're seeing quite a lot of drugs. And that may have affected the emotional stability of some of these soldiers. But as we've said, the other thing they're a bit unstable
about... Is it not what comes before that affects the emotional... Is it everything we've talked about?
That's the sort of seed corn. The triggers, I think, are this drug use, maybe. I'm just doing research now. But also these cartridges. Now, whatever they say to mitigate it, nobody believes it. And as I said, there's this initial flare-up. which takes place, and a chap called Mongol Pandey. He basically attacks an officer and an NCO. He's hung for it. But in testimony, he says, they're trying to Christianise us by making us bite these cartridges. That's the key point. And that is a prevalent theme throughout. They're trying to make us infidels. And that, of course, with cow fat and also pig fat, you actually really hack off both sections of the community, the Muslims
really target, that would
and the Hindus.
Hindus,
That's right.
And we're going to move on in just one second to the next section. But that is, like I said, it's often seen as the trigger point. We don't actually know if it was true or not, but it doesn't really matter in this story.
It doesn't really matter, but I think the interesting thing about this rebellion, and it's important to remember that this rebellion had two basic components. One, there was the mutiny in the army. So there was the mutiny army element, but the other one was civil rebellions. And the fact that they do come together is what makes 1857 so striking, because it's really important to remember that the East India Company had been facing small and large mutinies for decades before this rebellion. It wasn't the first time. And I think they misread the signs. And the fact that so many different religious groups, Hindus and Muslims, the Rani of Jhansi was Hindu, the Marathas were Hindu, but the Nawab of Awadh was Muslim. The fact that they all came together, and of course, incidents like what Chris has talked about, the Enfield rifle, united Hindus and Muslims in the armies too, but also amongst the common people. Because it's really important to remember that this was the coming together of centuries of grievances felt by small farmers and large landholders, princes and peasants, in the army and in the civilian population. And the fact that they could actually come together in this dramatic way is what the British simply didn't appreciate and understand. And they were caught off guard. And therefore, I would venture to say that for a few months in the summer of 1857, from May, when the Mangal Pandey, when the rebellion broke out in Meerut, which was a few kilometers away from Delhi, to July, when Delhi was lost, the East India Company came very close to losing it all.
Well, one of the things I would say is that this is not a straight East India Company against the local inhabitants. So you've got half the Muslim population saying, actually, we're issuing fatwas now to say don't fight against the British. So there's no sense of Indianness here at all. This is the impression we're giving at the moment. It's actually much more disparate than that. So the Maharaja of Gwalior says, I'm supporting the Brits, and he gets a mutiny himself against. So there's all sorts. It's much more mosaic-like than that. That's the point.
I think it's really confined to the Indo-Gangetic Plain, northern India, the northwest provinces, this region, and central India. There are some disruptions in Bengal, but the south is virtually loyal, completely calm. And there are a few outbreaks in the east. But really, that's one of the reasons that the mutiny, you can't talk about it as an all-India phenomenon or the rebellion.
Yeah, but even here,
yes, there's disloyalty. In the Punjab, eastern Punjab is supportive, western Punjab is not.
OK, absolutely fascinating. That is some of the background lead up to how the rebellion began. Now let's get into some of the key events themselves. OK, we've got a new map in front of us now showing the whole of northern and central India in 1857. And this is where the mutiny begins. As we were talking before the break, we said that a lot of what we're going to be talking about here occurs in kind of this area here. Chris, I'm going to start with you, because this is an outbreak that begins in Meerut, which is a city just outside Delhi.
Yep, it's a garrison town, and there's a wholesale sort of mutiny there. It gets out of control, and essentially the rebellion starts, and it brings in a lot of civilians. It brings in a lot of, obviously, disaffected troops. And out of the 74 infantry regiments in the Bengal army, 64 of them actually revolt. That's the key point, along with all 10 of the cavalry regiments as well. So this is a very, very big rebellion in this area. Must stress, though, we said it before, The Madras and Bombay armies do not actually mutiny.
Which you can't see on this map, of course. But...
Well, you can just see Bombay there. Look, so this whole area, the army is pretty quiet. Now, the key to this campaign is the fact that the mutineers head for Delhi. Yeah. And we've mentioned already they set up the last Mughal emperor again. They start giving allegiance to him. They want to make him the focus of the rebellion and also this national, if you like, enterprise. But the British are pretty quick to deal with this. And up here, you've got a number of people who are very aggressive. So you've got a chap called Sir John Lawrence. Now, his brother is right in the middle of this at Lucknow. So he's pretty worried about his brother. Yeah. You've got John Nicholson. You've got a number of other people. Remember, there are only 35,000 non-Indian troops in India at the time.
And there's around sort of 200,000 Indian troops?
Possibly even 300,000 to tell you the truth. But remember, it doesn't include these down here. So what have the British got in theatre at the time? They've got about 7 cavalry regiments themselves. You've got 7 European East India Company regiments, infantry, and you've also got about 20 infantry regiments, but they're spread throughout the whole of India. So they identify very quickly what the enemy centre of gravity is. It is Delhi itself. So they put together a force of people that they recruit from here, Sikhs, Punjabis, Pathans as well. They send out to the Gurkhas that they actually want their help as well. And they've got about 10,000 British European troops as well. And they actually set off with artillery straight away. As soon as the rebellion happens, en route to Delhi. And they occupy a ridge just to the west of Delhi, and they hold out there waiting for reinforcements. But they put pressure on the rebels absolutely straight away. Yeah. And it's that drive down from there that actually kills the rebellion almost in its tracks, to tell you the truth.
Interesting, because they do then make it to Delhi and they do take Delhi, but you're saying it kills it.
And once you strike into there, I think the rebellion is over. You've got major series of disaffection around Lucknow and Kanpur. Notoriously, of course, the massacre as a result of what happened at Kanpur. You've got people holding out in Lucknow. There are all sorts of mutinies popping out all over the place. It's like whack-a-mole, in fact. And so the whole of this is aflame at the moment in one way or the other. But the British Empire is mobilising resources. It diverts a force that's going to China, for example. It diverts another force going to Sri Lanka. And it says, we are going to bring the resources of the empire together here. And you even have, eventually, people... Remember, we don't have the Suez Canal. Mm-hmm. So rather than go around the Cape, they have troops marching from Alexandria down to Suez to be embarked in ships. And as we mentioned earlier, Britain is a maritime power.
Indeed.
So it can actually insert troops anywhere it likes around the peninsula. And that is the key to it, along with telegraphs and what railways are there already. So that strike down to Delhi obviously takes the mutineers by surprise. They can't concentrate to deal with that. Delhi falls. It's then a question of dealing with the rebels around Kanpur, Lucknow, and, as we said earlier, dealing with the area here in the mid-Jhansi and Gwalior and places like that.
We should say, but Delhi falls in September, but they've held it since May.
Yeah. And obviously they've tried to set up all sorts of administration. Mughal emperor's back again. No, he isn't. and all sorts of things. But this is very, very serious, vicious fighting. And I have to say, there's a lot of atrocity going on here as well. Yes. Very indiscriminate killing. And when they get into Delhi, the British are pretty merciless, to tell you the truth. They kill both the sons and the grandson of the Mughal emperor, the King of Delhi. They put him into exile eventually, having tried him, and they're quite ruthless about it. And of course, you've got fighting going on around Kanpur and Lucknow and places like that. But essentially, once this is isolated, it's all over, and you've got massive resources being brought in to deal with it.
Yeah, I'm going to bring you in there, Chandrika, because the figures are kind of quite stark. I think they estimate that around 6,000 British lost their lives, but it's between 100 and 800,000 Indians. over the course of the rebellion.
And some of the punishments were deliberately targeting caste.
Yeah.
So, for example, they were blown, mutineers were blown from the mouths of cannons. This was indiscriminate violence. But, of course, there was indiscriminate violence against British women and children, for example, in the infamous incident of Kanpur. But I would like to slightly disagree with Chris, because I think he's absolutely right in terms of what he described as the pincer movement, moving down from Punjab, and of course the other pincer movement, which was mobilizing troops in Bengal, moving up. So the Gangetic Valley, using the rivers, using transportation networks in the Gangetic Plain, which allowed troop movements, particularly movement of artillery and heavy cannons, because that's what really begins to turn the tide in Delhi. It's not numbers. Numbers, they're completely overwhelmed. It's the artillery, it's the gunpowder, it's the sort of heavy machine guns that they can pound Delhi with. That's what really begins to help them. Plus, of course, and Chris has mentioned John Lawrence and his brother Henry Lawrence. I mean, Henry Lawrence dies in Lucknow defending the residency, the so-called, where all the British had accumulated. He dies heroically there, in the summer of 1857. And it's not till 1858 that Lucknow is finally brought under control. Similarly, with Jhansi, it's not till April and March that the Queen of Jhansi, Rani Jhansi, is finally killed. They put up a final stand. She puts up a stand with a Maratha Nana Sahib in Kalpi. But that's, so that's almost a year. Yeah. And so, it's protracted, particularly if you look at somewhere like Lucknow, because Lucknow is the capital of Awadh. Remember Awadh with Wajid Ali Shah? So it's absolutely critical that Awadh is controlled, because 50,000 troops from Awadh had joined the initial mutiny and really made it. And these were armed troops. So that's what begins to make a difference. But again, as Chris has said, I mean, some of these battles, like the one in Delhi, it was so fierce. There was hand-to-hand combat in the narrow streets. And it's only when the troops from Punjab arrive with their warriors, but also with this machine guns that pound the walls of the Mughal fortress, that you actually begin to see literally the tide turning. But we're talking about almost a year. And in some cases, till the end of 1858.
What is happening in the second half of 1858? How does it all come to a close? Because as we've talked about, a lot of the key battles are sort of 1857 and the start of 58.
It's mopping up operations, really. I mean, it's ink blotting, to tell the truth. And one of the things that's critical, in fact, is that some of these guns that we've mentioned are actually naval guns. These very large naval guns that have been brought. It's the original field gun competition, to tell the truth, to bring these things to bear. And quite a lot of... you've actually got naval brigades operating here. So the resources of the empire have really been brought into play. But no, it's essentially... One thing that actually starts to settle the rebellion is the fact you've got a new Governor-General called Charles Canning. And Charles Canning's attitude to the locals is totally different to his predecessor, Dalhousie. And he says in July of 1857, look, if you haven't murdered anybody, then we're going to pardon you. It's as simple as that. He's known as Clemency Canning. And this is a major issue for settling parts of the country which hitherto have been fairly rebellious. And people are allowed to merge back into the countryside again, civilians and also the sepoys as well. And I think that plays a real part in actually bringing the rebellion to a halt, particularly in those areas where you've got these little ink blots where they're still active. You say, look, if you haven't murdered anybody, it's fine, we'll move on. And I think it plays a huge part.
And then the end of the rebellion, the East India Company is dissolved. As I mentioned at the top, the British Crown takes control of India. Is it 1877 Queen Victoria becomes the Empress? What is life like then for Indians in India after that?
Well, I think you talked about Victoria. I think it's really important to talk about the final coping stone, which was 1858 November, with the Queen's proclamation, which was really what Chris mentioned with bringing Canning's foresight, but also some politically and strategically important decision-making to bear on how the Crown was going to rule India. They wanted to disassociate themselves from the mismanagement of the company, and they really drew a line in the sand. So that's really the beginnings of this new vision for how India now was going to be ruled. And directly from London. So you had a Secretary of State in London and a Viceroy now. So no longer was he just the Governor General, he was now called the Viceroy, so ruling in the name of the Queen. And I think these, combined with major changes in treaties with some of these disaffected rulers, in pardoning mutineers, but also trying to emphasize rule of law and order and equal opportunities for Indian advancement in the administration, but in the army. And that, I think, I don't know if, Chris, you'd like to talk about that, but I think the army, the reforms in the army were, I believe, really very critical.
Well, it's very interesting because what you see is a vast influx of essentially British and European troops. It balances up. It used to be 1 in 6. It was 1 in 2 afterwards. And quite interestingly, the local levies don't have the latest rifles. That's the key point. The logistics aren't in their hands, and you cannot serve in the artillery if you are local. So that is balanced up a lot more. There's a lot more control, to tell you the truth, in that respect.
Recruitment. Recruitment too is now mixed up because the high caste Hindus are now not seen to be the best recruits. The recruitment strategies and the mixing of religious groups in all the armies becomes a point of policy for the government. And I think the results of this are clear in the decades following the end of the rebellion, because you see the role of the British Indian Army, not just in suppressing rebellion on the frontiers of India, but also serving, for example, in the Boer Wars and in the First World War. So, we do, and of course the Second,
you see the prestige of the Sikhs and the Gurkhas at this point.
Exactly. The Sikhs, the Gurkhas, they were the Pathans from the northwest frontier provinces, and therefore they were picking up on the mistakes that they identified. But I think the end result was a British Indian Army that was efficient, that had superior strength in all departments, and that was managed by commanders of foresight. And I think that was also a reason for why the rebellion was suppressed. Because though there was no lack of valor and patriotism on the part of the Indians fighting, and the rulers who took part. The Rani of Jhansi died fighting on horseback. But at the end of the day, the strategic decisions taken by some of these commanders like Nicholson, like Lawrence, and others made a huge difference. Because it was not enough to have people, it was how you use those tactics. And I think that's a key strength.
It's quite interesting. If you look at the commanders, there's one called Colin Campbell.
Yes.
He's been in every campaign virtually throughout his career. He starts in the Peninsular War, for example. He then fights in China. He's in Ireland. And by the time he comes here, he is a serious operator. If you look at pictures of him, he looks really beaten up.
The Crimea.
And recently he was in the Crimea, as you say, and he comes directly from 3 famous battles in the Crimea. And if you look at his dispatches, he's got as you say, a really clear vision about what has to happen. And he is the one that basically mops up Lucknow and Kanpur and places like that. And is a serious operator. There's no question about that. He also brings with him troops that have come from the Crimea, from the Persian War, from China and elsewhere. These are battle-hardened troops by the time 1857 comes around.
I have one last question before we move on to the Undone. We've talked a lot about the areas that didn't join, for example, Bombay and Madras. Is there, in the remnants of this, is there left any kind of ill will in the country towards the areas that didn't join? I know it's a very different India to the country we see today.
Well, you mean in the immediate aftermath? Well, I think certainly, I mean, the thing about India is that, you know, it's a subcontinent. Yeah. And you mustn't forget the size of the place.
It says 1.6 million square miles, just this map.
Yes, exactly. And even when we're thinking about the British Raj or the British Empire, it never really covers the whole of the subcontinent red. A lot of these principalities, including those who took part in the rebellion and those who didn't, remain under private rule. So, for example, the Nizam of Hyderabad, who, by the way, was considered the richest man in the world in the 1950s, I mean, on account of those diamond mines in the region. But anyway, the Nizam of Hyderabad retained his sovereignty through treaties. So a lot of these principalities were allowed to notionally govern their states. So I think that is something that most people don't recognize. I mean, when they think about the British in India, they think about the entire subcontinent, but that's not true. And I think those are the strategic decisions that the Crown could make and the company didn't do a good job of.
And also, I think there's a good idea that if you're actually subject to an empress, that brings back the echoes of the Mughal Empire, this unity it gives. And we mustn't forget that the reason why Victoria wanted to be an empress, of course, is that the German Kaiser had declared himself an emperor in 1871. So she would have had to defer to him had she met him. So being Empress of India was a neat way of actually dealing with that.
Brilliant. Well, that is the real history of what happened during the Indian Rebellion of 1857. Now let's undo all of that, because this, of course, is History Undone. OK, time to get into what we love doing here in History Undone and ask ourselves some of those really long-term questions. Had the Indian Rebellion succeeded? First of all, Chris, we often start with this question. Could it have? And if so, how? Well, if it was going to succeed, Fergus, I think it had to have succeeded in the early stages, to tell the truth. As I said, once I think Delhi's taken and you've got the empire mobilising itself to deal with this, you've got a real problem if you're in this area, particularly if the South isn't actually going to rise on your behalf. Remember, we've got Madras and Bombay armies totally intact, and so heading that way as well, and quite a lot of other troops heading from other theatres as well. So I think the only way it would have worked is if they had, well, here's the first thing. Not one person on the rebellion side had actually commanded above lieutenant colonel level. So their ability to mobilise large numbers of troops and logistics was well nigh impossible. So they had to be on the defensive very much. They could do local aggressive actions and things like that. But essentially they waited for the British to come onto them. So that was a bit of a problem. I think they got overconfident because they saw a lot of mutiny going on around them. As I said, 64 of the 74 foot regiments had actually mutinied by this stage. You're getting mutinies in other places popping up. And I think they lost what you always need to keep in warfare, and that's the initiative. And they gave the initiative to the British up here in the Punjab. They were able to recruit from the Sikhs, the Pathans and all the other people who are up there who actually said, I think we prefer the Brits to the Mughal Empire. And it may well be that actually putting the Mughal emperor up was a big mistake. But there was nothing to coalesce these people in a large formation, nor did they have the logistics to move in that direction. So you think if they went north at the start, that is the... Do you agree with that, Chandrika?
Well, I think there wasn't a clear strategy. And Chris is absolutely right. The initiative was lost in Delhi because I would argue that in May, June, July, Delhi, as far as a British person was concerned, was nearly lost. However, they had underestimated British resolve and the nature of the loyalty that was displayed by Punjab. Punjab is a very resource-rich part of the country, not just natural resources, but also physical, human resources. And so it was able to fuel that movement and have fighting forces recruited. So ultimately, the rebellion was defeated by Indians. Indians fighting against other Indians. Because even with the best will in the world, the best commanders, the best logistics, if you didn't have the manpower to man those guns, to get the troops moving, to get supplies moving, to have telegraphs working in your favour, to have railways transporting your troops, and so on. If you didn't have the manpower, you couldn't succeed. So the lack of coordination, the lack of a clear vision on part of the rebels, who was going to take over, what was going to happen, and disunity between large parts of the country.
You said
undermined.
You said they underestimated their loyalty. Are they thinking when they begin the rebellion, they're assuming they are going to join?
Yes, I think that's where the lack of experience and, as Chris said, the lack of leadership and forward-thinking, strategic plans, these are the things that existed, but only in small, isolated pockets.
I mean,
there was nothing pulling it all together.
This is a feature of mutinies throughout history.
It's a feature of History Undone, I was thinking, yes.
Nobody has a plan.
No, but the important thing about 1857 is that it wasn't just a mutiny.
Indeed.
There were civil rebellions. This was the largest shake-up, the largest fright that the British had ever faced in the history of their encounters in India.
And that distinction's like, I called it the rebellion at the top. The distinction is that the soldiers was the mutiny, but a full thing is the rebellion?
Well, yes. Well, the mutiny is usually what happens is a rebellion within the army.
Indeed.
But British and company historians at the time wanted to talk about the mutiny because they wanted to try and tell everybody, the propaganda value of isolating a few unfaithful rebels. But really, it was much more than that. There were peasants up and down the country. There were landlords up and down the country, traders, artisans, and of course, many of the princes in North and Central India. So this was a huge manpower that, was coming together. So, it's easy to look back. But it's when Henry Lawrence died, that was well before his brother had moved down and captured Delhi. So there was nothing given. And I would argue that at that point, things could have turned in the favour of the rebels. And they could have taken and kept Delhi because Delhi was with them till September. It wasn't relieved till September. Lucknow, which was the capital of Awadh. Now that is a very important story because by the time the British could mobilise troops, largely moving up from Bengal, it was well into 1858.
Yeah.
And so therefore, when the relief of Lucknow finally happened in the spring of 1858, there was indiscriminate looting. Such was the relief of the British to have finally subdued it. And remember, this is almost a year later. So, I think there were pressure points, there were turning points, and things could have gone differently.
And if you get the Gurkhas and the Sikh forces on side, Chris, does that fundamentally alter what we see here?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think what we've got to remember is that the Punjab's only just been conquered.
Yeah.
So who did the East India Company conquer Punjab with? Hindu sepoys.
Exactly.
So these Muslim and Sikh people are actually quite keen to have a go. So that motivates them a lot. If you look at some of the literature of the time, the British are saying, well, what we need to do is make sure that we turn the religious and also the political element in our favour here and motivate them to say, here's a chance to get back at the army that's actually just pillaged your land.
So you had troops coming in from the Crimea, troops diverted from China. So there was a pincer movement down from here in 1857 and up from Bengal because you needed time. Remember, this was when we didn't have roads everywhere. They had to use rivers, navigable rivers, and geography played a huge part in terms of how you isolate some of these rebels. And that's why this area was always considered to be a very important area because it was the Indo-Gangetic Plain.
Yeah.
You could move troops. It was not just fertile and prosperous, but you could actually have troop movements with ease. Whereas in the south, you had the Deccan Plateau. It was very difficult. And a lot of the rivers were not navigable. So how do you move your armies? You could have your artillery, you could have your guns, but how do you get them to where you want them? So I do think that Clemency Canning was very important, but he did underestimate in the summer of 1858 the strength of the remaining rebels, because it wasn't till the end of 1858 that you really do have the final end of any major rebellion.
So is there a situation in our counterfactual where the southern armies come on side?
No.
Yeah, that's the
Absolutely
problem.
not.
That's the problem. And that had nothing to do with disaffection or grievances. That had everything to do with interstate rivalry. The Nizam of Hyderabad did not want, for example, the Marathas to come into power again. He would much rather be loyal to a foreign power than support his age-old rival. So, I think this internal disunity put paid, I think, to any final victory for.
OK, in our version of events, the rebellion is going better and perhaps lasted longer than it did. Britain is still an imperial power with a royal navy, for example, Chris. I mean, how long does it last? Are we saying... We're not saying the British are wiped out of India, or...?
No, we're saying that the British probably retreat to the coast. They hold the coastal areas where they can actually sort of hold everything down. They can bring reinforcements in, and they say, OK, let's let them fight amongst themselves. Because the most likely scenario here, as Chandrika has said, is the fact that they all don't like each other very much. Yeah. So the likelihood is that the Mughal emperor is not going to impose his authority, and they're going to start fighting amongst each other. And I think the British will just sit back, reinforce, wait for their moment, and they'll go back in again and say, don't you think it was better with us? That's what I think is the counterfactual here.
Do you agree with that?
Yes, I think what happened was that the British became the residuary legatees of the Mughals. So the Mughal Empire had held large parts of the country together. In the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, that power had long gone. And what we see are principalities that are wealthy, that are prosperous, but that are rivals. Yeah. And there is no sense of general unity. And I don't think there is a lack of patriotism. And by that I mean they all wanted the Brits out. They all wanted the foreigners out. But I wouldn't go so far and say that there was a sense of nationalism. No. There was a sense of the nation as a whole coming together.
So in our counterfactual then, the British are sitting back, biding their time. Once they come back in, is it in India once again ruled by the East India Company or direct rule?
No. I think initially you're going to see a national mobilisation to deal with. Remember, this is a jewel in the crown. You're getting a lot of resources and money out of India. You want it back again. You've also got the route to further east as well. So you've really got to get it back. That's why I think they'll hold the coast. There's no question about that. And in many ways, if you translate it from a country level to a subcontinent level, it's what happened in South Africa. Mm-hmm. So, Cape Colony was used as the springboard to actually deal with the Boers and things like that. And I think you'll find that they would advance. I think a lot of these principalities would have said, look, we're on side here. We don't want any of this in the north. Yes. I think what we have to remember here, it's been brought out very well how critical the Gangetic plain is here. But also, this is the most populated area of India as well, very densely populated, because the 5 rivers basically fertilise and hydrate all the land here. So the crops are very, very plentiful. But I think you'll find... just one other issue that is probably relevant here is the British are actually involved in a number of other places at the same time. So you've got China with the Opium Wars going on. They've just had a problem in Persia. They've actually got a problem in South Africa at the same time. The Xhosa are rebelling. It's called the Great Cattle Killing War. And so they're quite overstretched. But the way in which they flood resources in to deal with this shows you what they could have done. And I think within 2 or 3 years, you'd have found fairly unopposed.
2 or 3 years?
Yeah.
So you think the British are sort of staying down here by the coast?
They'll stay where they're safe. They'll stay with those principalities where they feel they've got loyalty. And I should think they'll consolidate up here, don't you think?
Absolutely. I mean, this is the jewel that they had always been aiming for. When the British arrived, they strategically targeted ports because ports were avenues to do trade with. Yeah. But as they expanded, they critically moved around in a pincer movement up the coasts. Yeah. And those coasts were still there. Those ports were still there. Bengal was one of the richest provinces that was taxed very heavily by the East India Company, and that they still had. And they had Bombay on the other side, and they had Punjab. So they still had huge funding, if you like, to help them stick around.
Well,
and that's important. They had funding, they had resources, and they had support from the local communities. That's the key thing.
Well, perhaps I'm going to get nowhere with this counterfactual if the British are still sticking around in key areas, but I'm going to throw it in anyway.
Yeah.
Any other foreign powers looking at the situation, the French and the Russians?
No, in fact, the Russians are more interested in what's going on in Central Asia at the moment. One issue here, of course, is Afghanistan itself. One of the reasons for the rebellion was they saw how the British had messed up in Afghanistan and said, well, they're not so great after all. Now, there's a chap called Dost Mohammed here. He's up here on the frontier.
1842, the first Afghan war.
Yeah, and one of the things that Lawrence is worried about is what's going to happen if we go down to Delhi here. And they're worried about Dost Mohammed. The French aren't interested. There's a lot of sort of schadenfreude from the French saying, this is what happens, when you mess up in the empire. It's all over the newspapers and things like that. As I said, the Russians are there. The Chinese don't want to interfere.
No.
Because actually they don't like the Sepoys very much because they've seen what they've done in the Opium Wars.
Yes.
And so they're very indifferent to what's going on. So there's a vacuum in some ways in international relations where they say, Brits can get on with it. No question about that.
OK, we're going to have to bring it to a close in just a second then. So are we saying that the India that emerges probably quite a similar timeline to the one that happened then? Britain are keeping control in certain areas, it's just a bit delayed. How does India emerge in our counterfactual?
Well, let's be sure. If the British are kicked out, you delay modernisation in
But we're not
India
saying they're going to be kicked out, that's the thing.
No, that's right. But let's start as a starting point. Let's just say the British leave India, then the whole Indian modernisation, from law right the way through to railways, infrastructure, everything else, doesn't happen. And you actually have a fairly primitive society actually persisting into the 20th century without that modernisation. Now, if the British get back in again, what's quite interesting is I think you actually have a reinforcement of all the things that happened at the end of the rebellion, the mutiny anyway. And they happen at a much faster pace because they say we do not want this to happen again at this scale. So, so the bigger shock you get, the bigger modernisation and the bigger sort of sensitivity to local issues you're going to get.
The British Crown had to spend £50 million. That's the cost of the suppression of the rebellion. £50 million in those days' money. What would it be today's money? 500 million? I don't know how many. Maybe more.
6 billion.
6 billion. Well, that's a huge price for the Crown to pay. And from then on, you had something called the India debt. So the government of India had to make India pay.
Yeah.
And they realised that you can't make people prosperous and therefore line your own pockets if they're disaffected. So good government became the mantra.
That's it.
And whether we can disagree about what that good government meant and for whom, but nevertheless, a certain degree of enlightenment was dictated, if for no other reason that they didn't want to face another rebellion. It had taught them a lesson that they were not likely to forget.
Yeah. So if the British are kicked out, wholesale change. If the British keep...
No, if the British are kicked out, you basically delay the India we see today.
Absolutely,
by 2 generations, probably. It's as simple as that.
And if they remain?
If they go back and come back in again, you're going to see, I think, essentially an acceleration of what actually happened. And you're bringing forward India as a modern state much more quickly, to tell you the truth. So, as I said, the bigger shock they got, the bigger the reaction to actually say, we can't let this happen again.
Yeah.
The way it happened is, as we've seen, and it led through to 1947-48.
Yes, yeah. At the end of the day, I think there were 2 basic things that India gave the Brits. One, clearly the economic basis. They had a captive market. And second, the military. They had a standing army at no expense to the British taxpayer.
Absolutely fascinating. So we are saying, had the Indian Rebellion succeeded, it would have probably had to happen in the first few days and months to actually have a chance. And even if it does succeed, realistically, how long does it hold? Most likely, we are saying that the British retreat to the coast and consolidate. Now, in that scenario, the timeline that we actually see accelerates. If the British are removed from India, now that's a whole different question, the timeline likely slows by 2 generations. I'm afraid that is all we've got time for today. My thanks to Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry and Professor Chandrika Kaul for joining me. We'll be back undoing more history very soon. Remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. And you can also listen and follow the show as a podcast. Just search for History Undone in your podcast apps. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.